Today I'll be demonstrating for you how to sculpt a sculpture. We're going to be working with aluminum foil, which is i.e. the main feature of this channel, and walking through the character Alucard from Mobile Legends. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this medium, understand that it is not only very cheap, very recyclable, but also very malleable. And what's interesting about this is that when we're working with it, you're going to notice that it doesn't require adhesives to stick together, and it always gives room for further correction and reinforcement. Now, when we're using aluminum foil, it's going to be key to remember that you only are going to be using 3 techniques. And these 3 techniques are something you'll have to practice regularly to get down in this sort of style. I've been doing this for around 17 years now at the time of this recording, so don't feel bad if it doesn't look quite as right as it's going to appear on this video. I'm going to take it nice and slow, and we'll go through this together. And if there's anything that you would like to see made step by step, let me know in the comments, along with your requests if you'd just like those things to see made or sent to you. So starting obviously with any sculpture, if we're going to be doing a humanoid shape, we'd like a humanoid body. And starting with the skeleton, that's all we really need to establish. Now, our sculpture is going to be around this tall, about the same length as the foil roll itself, and that's always been a good barometer for something that's, useful, making full use rather of resources. So let's roll out a sheet that will start as our outline and base. Now really all that we're going to be doing at first is a stick figure. We need to separate the arms and the legs from the sculpture in individual sections without tearing up the whole piece itself. As you can see, I've made a tear, but I stopped right here. And in the same way, I'm going to tear off sections for the arms and also for the legs and for the head. Now in this, you see we've got a little outline, and this is going to be what we're going to work with in making the skeleton. Now if you can remember these 3 techniques, you're going to be able to sculpt anything with enough practice in doing them in the correct way. The first thing that you'll be doing, and I'll use a separate piece to demonstrate each of these, practice them on your own time, is firstly we're going to learn how to do twist ties. Twist ties are where you bring something to a point in sort of a screwdriver type fashion. This will be useful for fingers, for sword points, for extra details, for hair, for the nose, for other details that would be more fine-tuned. And when doing a corkscrew, you'll only be doing these 3 fingers, your pointer finger, your middle finger, and your thumb. And by twisting it, using the back 2 fingers to support, you will simply be twisting it into a fine shape and pinching it to the point where it comes out into a sharp line. Now you can just simply pinch and twist it into that sort of form, but it's going to be able to hold that kind of shape, and it's from those shapes you'll be able to produce fine details. The second thing you're going to be doing is essentially folding in for patterns, getting 2 pieces to stick together when normally they wouldn't. This would be what we would call adding fine details. So we have these 2 pieces separate. How do we unite them? How do we combine pieces to add extra details without the fact that they've been stuck together standing out? Well, simply what you have to do is by placing them on top of each other, you are to hold them in place, obviously. We've got 2 separate pieces, now they're on top of each other. You fold them and pinch them in together. And you see there's a little indentation there. All I have to do is press down on it and it looks flat. It looks whole again. And that's all that need be done in order to get off that kind of idea of combining 2 different pieces together and making it stick without any sort of adhesive. And then finally, making shapes themselves. What we'll be doing is simply rolling them into a mass. Now notice I'm not crushing my hand completely to make it flat. I'm just molding around a shape that I want it to look like. And once it has that 3-dimensional form, you're going to be able to make arms, legs, claws, and other different sorts of forms. So remember these 3 techniques and we'll get started. So starting firstly with that frame, we want 2 legs if we're going to be doing a human, or at least humanoid shape. So taking the whole roll in my hands, I'm going to roll it into a leg. And as you saw what we did before, it wasn't a flat shape, it's a three-dimensional shape. I'm simply cupping my hand around it, but not closing it entirely. I'm just making a little claw and squishing it to make this form. Now, what about the body? Obviously, he's not going to have that kind of gut. So what I'm going to do is, instead of legs separately, I'm going to make his torso the same way. Reaching my whole hand around the body, I will enclose it very, very gently until it has the sort of shape that I want it to. And that's really all I have to do, is just grip around to make the frame. For the arms and legs, the same deal. I reach around and encompass the entire sheet in my hand, and without closing my fist entirely, I mold it around to make it into a cylinder of sorts. I do the same thing on this end, and then for the head, I separate the neck from what will soon be the head by doing the same thing to the neck, but only with 2 fingers. Watch what I'm doing. In order to make the neck, we have a stick figure, a humanoid shape. Now for the head, it's going to be a little different. This will be the same kind of style, but with fewer fingers. I'm going to use only my thumb, my middle finger, and my forefinger, and mold an oval shape into the head. Now this doesn't have to look like what your final result is going to be. All we're making is a skeleton with which we'll build around the details. So right now we have the equivalent of a foil voodoo doll, but that's not obviously what we're going for here. We're making something much more wholesome, like a mobile game vampire. So going for Alucard's further details then, once you have the skeleton, the idea of what you have in mind of what the outline is going to look like, we now add the details. Starting with the simpler things, let's begin with pants. I'm going to tear off 2 sections that'll be about as long as he is tall and separate them for each leg. And wrapping around the skeleton, now notice, just like when we were forming the legs, I'm going to take the sheet of foil and wrap it around once again. But instead of crushing it all down into that form, I'm simply wrapping it around the form. So much more gently now, I'm making this a firm image of a leg. Now for the boot, as you can see, there's a lot of material left over. When I'm making someone's shoe, or I want some distinction between the foot and the leg, what we're going to do is something that's very key. And just like what we saw with the combination of 2 separate pieces, the folding over and pinching, that's all we're going to do. I'm going to take this sheet in my hand, and I'm going to, watch very closely, hold down the leg with my thumb. See where my thumb is? And fold it over. Now let me do that again so that it looks like this. I'm going to take my thumb and fold it over. This is what I want it to look like, because then, just like with the leg, I will then point and push down with my pointer finger rather, and crease it into the form so that it looks like there's a boot there. Now in the same way, I'll just crush down to make the sole of the shoe and use basically the sideways motion of my hand, but instead make a cupping motion. And I will be able to make the leg. Now obviously this isn't a pirate, that would look more like a peg leg. So to make a shoe, make a foot, I'll take my thumb and pointer finger and bend it. And that's really all that need to be done. If you want the shoe to have a more curved edge or a more firm edge, you can mold and fold as your heart is content. But this is essentially all that we need out of it, because all we need it to look like is a shoe, is a boot. Now that is only 1/2, and as you can see, there's some extra space up here. We're going to leave that, and you're going to see why in a moment, because I'm going to take this second sheet of foil, overlap the same way that we did the other leg, mold it around to make that sort of form, and now you see that if I flatten these out enough, it's going to look like a complete and whole pair of pants. Same deal that we did for the boot. Remember, this takes practice, so pay attention carefully and do this on your own time. Don't feel bad if you can't do it at first. We're just going to take the lower sheet of foil under, support it with our thumb, and fold it over, and then simply wrap it around so that there is a distinction between his shoes, his boot, and his pants. And then using these 3 fingers, I'm just molding and pressing around the skeleton that we've already made, and than making his shoe. And how do we make the shoe bent once again? Just bend it. It really is that simple. Now you see the posturing here, and you see his gait is a little bit wide. Well, it's really simple how you can get these two to be balanced, to stand in a more natural pose. When you take each piece in hand, just make sure that you're gripping it with the same gentleness that you would with a blanket. You're supporting the weight but not trying to bend the shape. I want to keep these two in line and am supporting each one where necessary. That is where we start with the basics. Now for combining separate pieces, that's what we'll be doing now with the arms. I'm going to take two separate sheets of foil, the same length that we would for the legs, and separate them accordingly. But instead of wrapping them around the entire skeleton, I'm only attaching them to the arm ends. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay each sheet of foil over those appendages and wrap them around the same way we would the pants. But notice, just like with the pants, I'm being very gentle. Why? Well, because I want this to be the start of what are currently now his wings. Now, how do I get these to stick? Because as you can see, the slightest tug will separate the two. The goal here, and again, if these two come apart, you can just unravel them and reattach them. The way that we get things to stick is by folding and pinching and pressing. So what I'm going to do to make sure that this sticks to his shoulder, in order to create it, is I'm first going to pinch it almost flat. Now catch that. See how close together my fingers are. I've pinched this almost to the point of being flat. Now I'm going to do the same thing that we did with the shoe and fold it into place, and it's going to stick. In the same way, pinch almost flat, fold it over, and pinch once again. This is how we get pieces to stick to each other. You simply fold and pinch them onto each other. Now if there's any exposed areas you want them to look nice and smooth, you only need to press them down. It really is that cooperative a material, unlike clay after it's been dried. Now if I want to make these arms look like arms, first I need to understand there's a difference between the bicep and the forearm. One's going to be skinnier than the other. So adding an extra layer, I'll do the same thing I did with the shoe by folding it over and wrapping it around in the same way that I did before. And note that it does look like a natural muscle. That's only because of my muscle memory. I've been doing this a very long time, and through practice have been able to, just without thinking, form these sorts of shapes. But all you need to do, for all intents and purposes right now, is get it into that kind of form, that kind of shape, where the upper arm is bigger than the lower arm. Because in the same way, the lower arm, all we're going to be doing is doing the same thing we did with the leg, just twisting around and molding and making that cupping motion with our hands. Now, keeping this in your palm, we then have to ask, well, how do we get fingers onto this thing? Well, the same way that we added arms, legs, and a head, arms and a head rather, to the sculpture. We're going to flatten this piece out as much as possible without separating it from the rest of the body, and tearing out a thumb, a finger, a middle finger, index finger, and a pinky. And with that essentially cartoon flattened oven mitt, we're then going to be utilizing that first technique I showed you by twisting. Now all I have to do is roll these into each other as gently as possible, because I don't want to separate them, and then pinching them towards the top at a fine point. And it's really just like doing a twist tie, like tying or untying a wire from something secured. You do this the same way for the thumb and for every other finger on the body. Now, to make room for mistakes, I'm going to demonstrate how to reattach something if it falls off. So for example, say I'm twisting this and one of the fingers comes off. Well, instead of just saying, well, I guess Alucard has 3 fingers on one hand, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tear off a longer piece, and what I'm going to do is sculpt as if that is just one separate finger. I'm sure you've seen in any of the videos that we've sculpted by request on this channel that there are times where I have made mistakes and simply improvised in order for it to maintain its shape. Notice that we have a single finger here. What I'm going to do is place it on top of the hand in place and use the extra length to wrap it around his wrist. And then how do we get it to attach? We pinch and press. That's all we need to do. So continuing on with the hand, you'd notice that we have fingers, but the hand itself, this section, is a little bit wider than we'd like it to be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, without disturbing the fingers, use all of my fingers to grip and press in very gently, just to get its form, what I want the hand to look like. Now note, now the fingers are a little bit too long. Well, I will just simply move them into place. And it really is this simple. You just need to be able to understand what muscle memory and how the technique is going to be applied, what muscle memory you need to use. So putting each finger into the place that I want it to, and notice, just like with the shoes, I'm folding in, pushing in, and pressing without losing the finger's form. That will be my hand. Now, fortunately, we don't have to do this on both ends since he's going to be holding a sword. I'll show you the same way that we did for the bicep. I fold it over and roll. Make sure the upper arm is bigger than the lower arm. I do the same thing that I did for the leg. And now, instead of making fingers, all I have to do here is make a claw. Now, this is where we get onto his sword. The sword is actually fairly straightforward since he's got sort of a Cloud from Final Fantasy VII type look. We're going to tear off a sheet of foil about as tall as him. And when we lay these two side by side, we want that general idea, because the idea of a sword is to be reinforced. Now, Alucard's sword will first start off with the main details, the blade itself. We'll add the handle and stuff later. But the blade is going to be fairly simple. What you have to do is, with your finger, lay out for yourself as straight a line as you can and fold on it. And do that again until you have about twice the length that you want the sword to be on its own. Once you have that little rectangular ruler of a foil sheet, and this is what you want it to look like, just fold it over again and again. Keep it nice and flat and fold it one more time. Now once you have it folded into a place where it's a little more firm, that is where you then have what you would consider a blade. But there is a little bit of a space in between these two places, as you can see. And we don't want the sword talking to us from the side. So what I'm going to do to make sure that this part stays not only flat, but sharp, or at least look sharp, is to take the excess length of whatever folding length that you set it to, fold it over, and notice I'm overlapping a little bit as well on the places in between. Folding it over so that each piece is about half overlaid on the other. I'll show you from the side here. Do you guys see and recognize that there is an indentation, a curve going down the side? It's like a little wave, so to speak. Well, now that you have this curved end, you're going to pinch down. Notice how I set it almost flat, and run your finger down the end until you reach the other side. That is how you make a sword edge. Now, what about the tip? And we'll be doing the classic Alucard blue look as opposed to the Valentine skin, since all that you really need to add as far as that is concerned is a heart edge to the shape. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But to get this set to a point, the same way that we folded this line, we fold a second triangle. And bringing it as close to the edge as possible, you see the fold that has been already put there. You fold on that line and press in so that any sort of discoloration is, any alteration in the form is going to be negligent at this point. Now notice that there is an overlap. So how do I fix this? Well, I just keep folding it over without losing that first triangle shape. I keep going around it and press down once I have as fine a tip as I need it to be. Now, that's not as sharp as I'd like it to be, so I'll use the twist tie technique, the same thing that we did with our fingers, until it's going to look like a sword edge. Now, once we have the blade, I then am going to take a separate section that I'll consider the handle and Holding my finger down to preserve the parts I don't want to turn into the handle, I simply pinch and fold and pinch again and fold and pinch again and fold. And then once I have a form that I think I can support, I roll it in the same way that I would an arm and a leg. And that is where he will be holding it from. Now, you guys who play this game, who know what Alucard's sword looks like, know that it also has a handle edge. So I will add on extra pieces for extra details, just like we did for the pants and the fingers on the hand. I'm going to keep in mind what I want this to look like. I want to make sure, and let's make the handle a little bit longer here. I want to make sure that the handle isn't going to look too different than what the rest of the sword actually is going to end up looking like, and as well as close to the real deal as I can. Now, I could take my time on this, but for the sake of those of you who are just beginning, you guys know that there's a little guard that takes place in the blade here and a folding over with a circle on the inside. I'll just show you how to make the guard. I want to add this piece in, so what I'm going to do, pardon me, Alucard's body, keeping this as straight as possible, and again, if this bends, it's no big deal. You can just straighten it out by putting your thumb in through the center and keeping it in that shape and form that you want it to. I'm going to add on this guard piece by pinching with my whole hands in this little claw motion exactly where I want that guard to be. And with the overlap, I'll stop it exactly where I want it to, at this end about halfway. Folding over and keeping my fingers in place to support it, I will smush the pieces into place that will end up matching where the guard is supposed to be. Now, if it falls off, don't worry. As long as you can keep the shape in, we'll be doing the folding and pinching later. So I will pinch this piece in to give it a nice flat edge, and I'll do the same on this end on top of the blade in order for it to keep that shape. And all I really have to do after that is just flatten it. Keep pinching, keep pushing, keep shoving the edges of the foil into the place that you want it to be in order for it to look like what you want it to. Now, with this extra excess piece, we'll add another wrapping layer that will end up looking like the edge of the sword, whose name would escape me because I'm not an expert on these things. I'm a sculptor, not a weapons designer. But nonetheless, it's just really that simple as folding around the skeleton the same way that his pants did. And if you want to keep folding over and wrapping it to give it extra details and so forth, that is completely up to your discretion. As long as it looks like a sword, that's all that we care about. So recognize that. It's all a matter of pinching and folding to keep it in place and putting it exactly where you want it to be in order for it to hold its proper form. We'll make it as cloud-esque as possible to keep it simple. Now, this will be a sword. Now, how do we attach this to this? Once again, fairly straightforward. You put it in between the two claw ends and wrap it around in the same way that we did with the extra detail on the guard. And by pressing and literally crushing the hand into the sword, but not so much that you crush it flat, but in the same way that we molded the pants around the leg, we're molding the hand around the handle. So once it looks like this, and once it is actually attached, it will look like it's being gripped and it will function accordingly. And that's all that we really care about, is fashion and function. Now, we have a body, we have a sword, we have his pants, but the most detailed aspect of this that's going to stand out more than anything else is going to be his cloak. And this is where we have to start getting a little creative, if we haven't already. So taking another sheet of foil that would be about as long as Alucard is tall, at least your model of it, we want to make this as close to the character in the mobile game as possible. So just like we did with this guard on the sword, and just like we did with the blade itself, what we're going to do, and I'll lay this over him so I don't keep bumping into it, is we're going to focus only on the edges and make a shape. Now this will come in handy as well when you use this technique if you want to make him in a different skin, say the Demon Hunter skin or the Valentine skin, molding a heart shape or molding jagged lines, so to speak. What we want is for this cape to be flowing outward, but instead of folding over, I'm just simply going to be pinching on the edges. So notice this outline that I've set for myself. Just by putting my finger into the foil, I'm going to pinch the edges to form that kind of shape. Now notice that I'm not pressing down yet. I've literally just made a wall, so to speak. That is when I then press it down and flatten it. Now notice this sort of came undone. That's no problem. We'll just pinch it up again and press it down. Pinch it up again and press it down, and repeat this process until it's going to look exactly like you want it to the outer flowing cape. And the same way on the other side, we'll just pinch it until it forms a wall, fold down, push down, press down, do it again until it has the shape that you want it to. Now, you can see that I've left a lot of room for myself to work up here, and that's because this isn't just a cape, it's a cloak. So I have to be a little creative as to how I'm going to get this to fold around him. Instead of making sleeves and having to, wardrobe him into it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, with a little bit of forethought, tear off a section, but not completely off, just the same indent as if I was making an arm, and do that on both sides with some space in between. You'll see why I did this in a moment. And remember that all of this was learned by me through trial and error. Once you figure out a technique, if you find something that works better than this, as long as you remember the twist tying, the folding and indenting, and as well the whole idea of making patterns and shapes, then everything else will ultimately fall into line. Tear down those strips until they are about the length of Alucard's shoulders, because that's what we want his cloak to ultimately be. And that seems about right. What I want to do is, and I'll take him off of this in a moment so you can see what's happening, but I want these pieces to go over his arms so that we can have the inner workings of his coat, so that when I'm molding it onto him, it's going to end up looking like this. And that way it'll form a jacket. But since you can't see it due to the reflective nature of this metal on camera, I'm gonna do this separately, and you can do it while it's on top of him. So remember, his arms will be going underneath the sleeves, and this will be the inner workings of his jacket. Just like I did for the edges, I'm going to do it on the inside of this coat, but instead of pressing down, I'm gonna have a use for this later. So all I need to do is to make it fold into that shape. Once these things have formed that kind of shape that I want it to look like, I will then fold these over his shoulders. Pardon the construction in the background there, everyone. Fold these over his shoulders, and all I really need to do is, just like I cut this into two sections, I tore it by hand, I'll also do the same for the back and combine them. But notice I haven't done that yet. And why? Because there's another detail that we need to add. Alucard has his shirt somewhat opened, which shows his pectoral muscles, possibly for the ladies. And in order to add that kind of detail, it's actually a lot simpler than most people would give it credit for. All you need to do is, with enough room to combine it, to mesh it onto the neck and onto his waist, you can tear off little ribbons if you'd like, in order to be able to wrap it around in that form. But the key detail here is going to be obviously the two muscle groups that are on his chest. So in order to do that, what I want to do is use my thumb and make the indentation so that it looks like a chest muscle. But obviously it's not just going to be one bar. There are going to be two. And in order to do that, I need to have some space in between. You'd notice the indentation here. If you just do one whole bar, and he's not as barrel-chested as you'd like him, all you have to do is use your finger and make a small little impression in between them and push. And once you have that shape, once you have that form, that would put in between the pectoral muscles that little rivet. That's all that's necessary. Combining this muscle tone and wrapping around the ribbons and pinching and pressing, as we saw, we combine anything. That's all that needs to be done. The goal is to keep the shape without impressioning on it. Now say I accidentally do that. If I make an impression and it ruins the shape. The goal is to make sure that this rivet in between, this fissure, so to speak, stays there. So all I have to do if I mess up the shape of his pecs is to fold it over and watch what I'm doing carefully, use my thumb to remake the impression. And that's all that needs to be done. And for the ribbons that you've made or haven't made for yourself, you can just wrap them around, pinch and fold, and it's going to stay as snug as a bug. Now, once the muscles have been defined, we can add on his cloak by putting, once again, as was demonstrated earlier, the different sections of the cloak over his shoulders and the back sections behind him. And combining the two of them, I'll fold them over each other. And as we saw before, when combining two pieces, you, with your fingers behind for support, fold in almost flat and press until it's going to end up looking exactly the way that you want it to. And the same way on the other side, you overlap them and press on them and pinch them into place so that they look the way that you want them to. Now, how do I get this from looking like a cape into a coat? Because it still looks kind of squarish. Well, I just simply support back and mold in the shape in the same way that I did with the legs. And very gently just mold around it. And on the same way for these, I have to be a little bit more precise to get the opening blouse details. So instead of cupping, I'm going to pinch. And until I have the shape that I want, I'll keep pinching and keep pressing until what is in my head is what's on the metal. And that is how we do the cloak. Now, all of this is well and good, but there are still some minor details to fill out. There is his shoulder guard, there's his face, there's his hair, and we can't do without the hair. So let's focus on that. Doing a hair as well as a face, a hair, some hairs, and a face, you take a sheet of foil that will be at least twice as long as the face would be wide. And with this in mind, remember that it's all about the nose if you're doing basic details. We can focus on lip details and eye color and eye indentations, all the other stuff another time. But all I really need to do is to pinch in a stick figure with his legs spread out, the body in between, the arms stretched out without a head. And once I have this stick figure-like body, this pattern immersed into it, it will come out like this, like this, like this, and like this. The key is that little indentation in between, because that's going to be our nose. I will put my thumb beneath where I want the nose to be pointed and push down with my other thumb, push down and into the shape, all the while using my other thumb to push upwards. Now, this obviously isn't what cheek muscles look like, so I will push them down. And if you look at the foil on a level surface, you'll see that we have a little bit of a nose shape going on there. Now, since it is a small shape, that is all that is really needed off of this. But once again, remember, this is your first time doing this, so don't feel bad if it doesn't look perfect. The eye details, just like with the pectoral muscles, we can just make the indentations with the thumbs and pinch the eyebrows into place, and we have exactly what we need for a face. Now, for hair, before we attach the face, sew it onto his skull, so to speak, when you're making hair, all you really need are, in the same way that we did fingers, enough to show that there is hair present. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tear off some long strands of spaghetti-like hair, and it's going to make him look like he's been run over in a cartoon as well as struck by lightning. It's all going to be sticking up. And I'm going to make this as if it was an 8 to 6 fingered hand. And in order to do that, I'll just keep tearing out without tearing off. And if you happen to separate any of the pieces, don't worry about it. All you have to do is tear off another piece from your main foil roll, and everything will be fine once you pinch it back into place. Now, what we did with the fingers, you twist with these 3 fingers. The pinky will be sitting this one out, and rolling these together in order to form a straight and sharp line. Now, it doesn't obviously have to be too sharp, but obviously not blocky either. And once they all look like individual sticks, you will be able to fold and curve and twist them into the kind of pattern and shape that you want them to in order for it to resemble Alucard's mullet style hair. Or if you would prefer a more straight look, you can obviously make the stick shorter, but the key is to give yourself room to work, because note, this is the top of the eyebrows. This is where his hair starts. So we're going to be working with this a little bit. Moving to attaching it, we have this section for the neck, and just like we did for the nose and putting our thumb behind to support it, I want to make a chin by pushing my thumb through and making that sort of indentation, then wrapping it around the neck, the same neck that I started with in crushing it to make that frame and skeleton. I attach these the same way that I attach the pants, by wrapping it around and making that impression on it until it's nice and snug. Pushing down on the mouth, the chin will find its own place. Now it's a little wide, so I'll just pinch it in between until he looks exactly the way I want him to. If the nose is sticking out a little too much, you can twist and push it in as much as you'd like, as long as the shape isn't going to be disturbed. And now, once we have all of this extra piece for the top of the head, this is where the hair starts to come in. Now, without going into too many details, obviously Alucard in this form, his blue form, has sort of a mullet going on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use these 2 fingers to cut behind it and make the impression of his skull. And pushing it down, watch what I'm doing here, I'm pushing it down to where his brain should be. My 2 fingertips would be his brain in this moment. I roll the fingers, so to speak, what's soon to be his hair, around it until they are all able to be messed around with. Now, if I need to solidify it a little more, I'll just make the impressions, but you want to make sure that these stay straight, because as soon as you start bending them, that's the kind of shape that you want them to stay in. Well, that's what the case is for finer details. So, starting first forward with the hair, I'm going to make it curve around the back of his head. And in various situations, I don't actually have to have 10,000 strands of hair, just enough pieces of hair to make it look like he actually has hair. Messed up the nose a little bit. I'll just start pinching to make sure that it stays in the right state. And once everything looks the way that you want them to, you have been able to finish your Alucard. Now, if you have any questions and want further clarification on the sort of details that we were discussing in this video, feel free to ask in the comments. If you would like other things demonstrated step by step and seeing these things done more slowly as opposed to fast pace and to music, let me know in the comments. And if there's just things you'd simply like to see made or made for you, contact me wherever the social media venue which you prefer would be found. Instagram is thefoilguy777. Facebook would be Facebook would of course be the Foil Guy. The Twitter feed would be foil_guy, and YouTube, obviously, you're watching this video. I'm sure you know the address. I want to thank you all for taking the time to watch, and I look forward to doing more for you very soon.